Friends online, welcome to our Sunday morning session. Salgira Mubarak to all of you. We'll start with recitation of Ginan verse. I would like to invite Yasmin to please come forward and recite the Ginan for us. Thank you.
Ame Hari Para Pa Yaji Chara Chukana Kasa Mala Papaja Taryaji Hetano Mela Varore Apana Satakurasu Ki Chechi Manano Mela Varore Apana Parakurasu Ki Chechi Tutaro Sansa Raparale Chori Muki Chepai Thakaro Sansa Shahaji ne Name Tarichi Ere Sansare Pala Shukaramaka Makiji.
Thank you so much, Yasmin, for such a beautiful recitation of Ginan. I would like to invite our speaker today, Zahir Lalani, scholar. He has spoken to us before on this group, and at that time he had mentioned about his research and his work on monoreality, and finally he is here with concept of monoreality. So I would like to request all the friends to stay on mute, please, and share your questions and comments on the chat session. Zahir, we also would like to keep your camera on. Our friends like to see the speaker, please. I'll give the microphone to you now. Yali Madad, welcome.
Yali Madad. Thank you, Nimet, and Salgir Mubarak to everybody. I hope it is a joyous day for everyone, despite our current problems with COVID. So I'd like to actually begin with just clarifying that this is obviously a two-part lecture, and I'm not expecting to actually talk that much about monoreality today, because in order to begin to talk about monoreality, we actually need to go into depth about why there is a need for this concept of monoreality. And I think that's the first thing that I want to try and tackle today, is to understand the context, to understand why Imam brought about this very, very complex philosophy in the memoirs. And it also goes without saying that we actually have to think very clearly about why the Imam chose to expose this concept, which actually I don't think this word had been used by anybody else prior to the Imam. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe so. And why he would have chosen to explain this concept in what is effectively a book for the public, and that is the Memoirs of the Aga Khan. It wasn't explained in the Ferman. It wasn't explained, in any private gathering. It was actually exposed in a public book. So this concept is something that's actually very complex. It's not easy to display. Monks will have things they can add to the conversation. So let's actually begin by why I'm not specifically going to talk about monoreality in this first part. And that is that we actually have to look at what our foundation is within the faith. Now, there are many sayings, there are many, within the West, within the East, there are many sayings about building strong foundation. And that if our foundation is not strong, if our foundation is not straight, no matter how high we build and no matter how much we try and make things straight, it's very hard to correct what is a fundamental error at the foundation. And that same principle goes for religion, for religious principles. That if our religious principles are not strong and stable and well-founded, then as we go forward in life, as we mature, as we try and deal with issues, with religious dilemmas, with philosophical dilemmas, our foundations don't necessarily allow us to find a way forward. We keep getting roadblocks because the answers don't make sense, or the answers are contradictory, or the answers actually don't work for the generation that we're in. And in my dealings with a lot of the youth, that is one of the issues that we face, is that actually in many ways, a lot of what we used to teach, I mean, it's changing a lot now. The youngsters have found it very hard to relate what they're taught with what their daily lives are about. So I think first and foremost, we need to look at what is our understanding and why that understanding needs, possibly a little bit more depth. So the first question that we have to look at is to create or not to create. What is the right answer? And what we actually have to look at is what the word creation actually implies. Does the concept of creation help us in our understanding of who we are, who God is, who the Imam is? Or does the concept of creation as we normally understand it hinder that process? So that's one of the things we need to look at. So let's start with how we normally teach our children in school. Now, a lot of you, will be familiar with this diagram. And when we're teaching our young children in school, and by young, I don't mean toddlers, I mean, up to the teenage ages, when we're teaching them about atomic structures, how the world works, how things are built together, there is a very common diagram that's presented, and it's what's known as the billiard ball model. Right? We just use standard things that look like billiard balls, and it's presented as one central ball with lots of other balls going around it. And that model is actually a very good way of teaching children how an atom looks and how an atom works. It's a very basic understanding, but it is a very useful way of explaining how an atom works. But then we have to ask the question, is it accurate? And the answer in today's science is most definitely not. But does it matter? When you're speaking to a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old, does it matter that this diagram is not necessarily accurate, but it presents some of the fundamental ideas for someone to try and begin that journey of understanding? No, it does not matter. It is a very good way of explaining something so someone can try and understand the basic principles of what an atom is. But were I to use that same model when I'm doing a PhD in physics, I would hit lots of roadblocks. There would be lots of things that would make no sense. There would be lots of things that just would not work in the day-to-day world. And that is exactly what science found. And obviously, there are things that I think most people are now familiar with. and the very famous Einstein introduced this whole concept of quantum mechanics. There were other scientists involved in all of that, but there are some very, very key people who've played a major role in bringing a very different and complex understanding of what the atom is really like. This model still works, but there are some extremely weird and wonderful science theories around how it truly is. It is extremely difficult work. It is extremely difficult concepts. But what they have found is that the models they now have actually reflect the real world. We would not be doing this conversation today without those discoveries, without those things around quantum mechanics. We would not have computers. We would not have the ability to talk to each other across the globe. So they have proven that actually the complexities they have modeled are truly how things work, not this very basic model. So we then have to start talking about, so I just need to move something out of the way. We then have to start talking about some of the premises that we have. And I'm not talking about as individuals, I'm talking about in general. Most of the monotheistic faiths have a very general way of understanding God and creation. And I think from my conversations with a lot of Ismailis, it goes for a lot of us as well. And the first premise is that God is eternal. The eternal God created this universe in stages and then created humankind as the pinnacle of that creation. And the first issue we have to grapple with is, what is eternity? Eternity is something very difficult for us to conceptualize because it isn't something that we perceive. It is not something that we have experienced. We may experience long passages of time, but that is not what eternity is. So the first thing we have to understand is when we talk about God being eternal, what does that actually mean? And if we consider our understanding of what eternity is, we then have to ask the question is, God was there for eternity, quite happy. And then all of a sudden he decided to create the universe, create the world, create humanity. And we have to then ask the question, does that imply that God had a need? Why all of a sudden was there this desire or this need or this thought to create creation? Why? If you've been there for an eternity and you haven't had a creation for eternity, why all of a sudden is there a need or a desire to make a creation? And if we talk about it in that sense, it's very hard to understand why an eternal God who is there forever, 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 why all of a sudden he had to create. Is it need? Is it boredom? Let's look at another premise. God created humankind. God gave them intellect and choice to either do good or do bad. And the general concept, and I'm talking about a general concept, is that the good are rewarded with an eternal heaven, and the bad are punished with eternal torture. But again, we then come to a question. We are told that God is merciful. That is one of his greatest attributes. God is merciful. It was God who created us and gave us the ability to do good and bad. It was God who created the ability to do good and bad. So we then have to ask the question, is that in this concept of an eternal heaven and an eternal hell, how can this merciful God punish someone for eternity? Is there no way to repent forever? And again, I'm talking about general concepts across all the monotheistic faiths. So these are the kinds of questions that arise when we think about our general concept of creation. And the answers are not very forthcoming when you look at it in that particular way. So we now have a conundrum. Yes, we have to use creation as a basic principle to explain to children, and by children I mean in the philosophical sense, people who are not mature in religious philosophy, we have to explain the basic principles of creation so that there is at least some way of understanding the relationship between a God and the creation. And that is what creation allows us to do. It allows us to start that journey of understanding the concept of a God and understanding this relationship that humanity has with God. But as we become more mature, as we become more inquisitive, just like with that model of the atom, does that creation model that we normally have work for us having a much deeper understanding of who God is? And in fact, the creation model as we normally consider it causes us more questions than it answers. So let's actually look at visually what that creation model is. And that creation model is like a very, very long line. We have what I'm calling pre-eternity, this whole period of eternity, whereas God has been without a creation. And then there is the creation itself. And on the assumption that this creation isn't eternal, after the creation, where there will be again an eternity, what is known philosophically as post-eternity. So within this picture of a line, we have this concept of an eternal God creating the universe at some point. But even that raises a question. How long is eternity? Very, very long. How long is the timeline of the universe? In relation to eternity, not very long. It is more akin to a grain of sand within a huge desert. So within this line of eternity, why was there a need or a purpose or a desire to create what is effectively a grain of sand within the scale of a desert? What purpose did that serve? Why was that done only for that period of time? And again, that raises a lot of questions of the why. Why was that done when for eternity God is there? But there is one primary implication of this view that is actually fundamental. And if we draw out this concept of a pre-eternity and a creation and then a post-eternity, there is one thing that comes out very clearly from this. And that is that this is a timeline. This is something that is progressing a long time. If we try and explain to ourselves the concept of eternity, eternity in the way that we as human beings would define it is a passage of time. That is how we define eternity. It is a passage of time without a beginning and without an end. But the conundrum now comes, that means that God creates in time. That God himself is within this timeline and he is creating within a timeline. Does that make God subservient to time? Is time greater than God himself? Our concept is that God is above and beyond time and space. But if we look at the concept of creation as this diagram, then God is actually subservient to time. So let's look at the science of time. What does science think time is? I think I would be right in saying that most of us consider of time, and we think of the ticking of a clock, all of us consider that to be one of the most constant things that we have in our lives, is the ticking of a clock. But then let's ask how long an hour is. An hour is 60 seconds, 60 ticks of the clock. And how long is a day? A day is 24 of those hours. So 24 times the 60 times the 60. But how do we actually define what a day is? We do not actually define a day as being 24 hours. Scientifically, the day is defined as the time it takes for the Earth to do one full rotation. That is actually how we define how long a day is. But if a day of 24 hours is how long it takes the Earth to go around its axis, what about Venus or Mars or Saturn or any of the other planets? They don't take our 24 hours. Their circular motion is on a completely different scale. So when we talk about today, it is a day of the Earth. A day on Venus or Mars is not the same thing. What about a year? A year, scientifically, is the time it takes for the Earth to go one full circle around the Sun. Is that the same as Venus or Mars or Saturn or Jupiter? No. It's completely different. So our concept of a day, of a year, of a month is only relative to us on this Earth. But let's go outside our solar system. All these definitions of the day and the year are based around our motion around our sun. But if we go outside our solar system, it has no bearing on our sun. So how do we now define a day or a year or a month? Because our sun has no bearing on what happens outside our solar system. So time, as much as we think it's a constant, is actually not a constant. But it gets even more interesting. And again, if we look at the revolution in science that's occurred in the last 100 years, and obviously again, I'll mention Einstein, but Einstein is only one amongst a number of very key people in this area. They have developed models of how time works that has actually taught us a lot more about how we look at time. And one of the fundamental things that was brought out in this century, in the previous century, was this whole concept of space-time, that time and space are inextricably linked. They're not two separate things, they're actually one entity. The most important thing in terms of our conversation today is that space-time was a direct result of the creation of the universe. Space-time is a direct result of the creation of the universe. So if time is a part of our creation, how do we define eternity before the creation existed? If our concept of eternity is usually a passage of time, but time never existed before the universe actually existed, how do we then define what eternity is? And that breaks our model of that timeline-based post-eternity and pre-eternity. There is no concept of time progressing before the universe was actually created. Now, just as a sideline for anybody who's really interested, the whole concept of time is even more complicated than that. And anybody who's interested, I'm not going to talk about this in any form of detail, but there is this concept of time dilation. We all think that, okay, maybe a day is different on the Earth, and a day on Mars is different, and a day on Venus is different, and a day on a planet in a different solar system is different. But actually, the thing that's constant is the second. The ticking of that clock, how long a second is, must be constant, surely, because everything is based around this general concept of this passage of a unit of time. But science has blown that away, and they've actually proven this in a number of different ways. We don't see it because of the scale that we're working at, but scientists have done experiments to show this is actually the case, that where you have different bodies moving in the universe at different speeds, that their time is actually different. And one of the key examples that they use to explain this is people on a train that are traveling very fast and people on a platform. The time that the people on the train see is different to the time that the people on the platform see. So this thing that we thought was really constant and something that we can rely on, the second, the unit of time, the unit of time for the person on the train is ticking at a different rate to the person that's on the platform. Time is not a constant. So again, the whole point of this is our reliance on that picture that shows this line of pre-eternity and then a creation and a line of post-eternity, with time being fundamental to that passage. Time is not as simple as that, and time doesn't work where there is no space-time, where there is no physical creation. So let's then look at the story of creation. And what does a general story of creation tell us? Most of the people who follow the Abrahamic faiths have the concept of the 7 days of creation. So immediately, based on what we have just talked about, when we talk about the 7 days of creation, which day are we talking about? At the beginning of the universe, the earth never existed. So it's not the 24 hours that we consider. The solar system wasn't there. So it's not even a day based around anything within the solar system. So which day was the Bible or the Torah or the Quran referring to when it says that God created the universe in 7 days? Because as we have just been through, the whole concept of time, the whole concept of a day only came about once the universe was at least partly formed. So again, going back to that model of the universe being created as part of this pre-eternity and post-eternity line, the words that we would normally use in explaining that little blip of the universe is at some point God created the universe. But how do we define a point in time when time itself doesn't exist? So that concept of a time-based linear progression of creation doesn't work. So let's look at another aspect of the sort of philosophies that we have. We have the philosophy that God transcends all of creation. God is above and beyond everything. We talk about the God above. The issue that we have with that, or not the issue, but the statement that we make when we say God is transcendent over everything, God is above and beyond everything, is that we immediately have a separation between the creator and the creation. That concept of transcendence and being above and beyond everything in our minds that don't understand the concept of transcendence, the way that we deal with that concept is we put God above the whole of his creation. And I use the term above loosely. So we have this thing about, one, that there is this creation happening at some point, and we can't define it because there is no time. We have this other concept where we consider God to be above or outside of the creation. That is, again, a very general concept across the Abrahamic faiths. So let's then start looking at what our esoteric philosophy says and how that matches up to these principles. So the first philosophy that Sultan Shah points out in the memoirs, he says, we live, move, and have our being in God. We live, move, and have our being in God. Now, if we look at the concept of the transcendent God and the God that is outside and above all of creation, then we need to ask ourselves the question, in that view of God and him as a creator, how do we live and move and have our being in God? Because God transcends all of creation. So it's a question that Imam has obviously made that point very clearly. But the concepts that we use make that something very hard to understand, because we consider God to be above and beyond creation. What's another philosophy that we have? In the Quran, in 50:16, it says, we are closer to him than even his jugular vein. This is God talking. We are closer to him than even his jugular vein. Again, within the concept that we have of a transcendent God, how is God closer to us than our own jugular vein? Quran 2:156. To Allah we belong, and to him is our return. To Allah we belong, and to him is our return. So this goes back to our original premise that we had at the beginning about the concept of heaven and hell. On the one hand, the Quran here says that we have come from Allah and to him we will return. On the other hand, the Quran also tells us, as does the Bible, as does the Torah, that there is this concept of eternal punishment. So which one is correct? Both of those concepts cannot be correct. You cannot have eternal punishment as well as looking at what is here, which is that we will return back to our Creator. So again, within the concepts that we have and the general way that we understand things, how do we square off this particular ayat of the Quran that says that we will return back to our original Creator? So let's look at something else that Sultan Mashai said again in the memoirs. Creation is not a unique act in a given time, but a constant and perpetual event. Creation is not a unique act in a given time, but a constant and perpetual event. Again, go back to that concept that we drew out of our general understanding of pre-eternity, creation, and post-eternity. That is talking about creation happening and then at some point creation finishing and us returning back if we go to the previous ayah. But Imam clearly says that is not the concept of creation. Creation goes on and on and on. It is not given time. And remember, one of the things that we said is that that view of that timeline means that creation is happening at a point in time. There is one point in time where creation occurs. That in itself was a conundrum. And Imam clarifies that by saying that is not what occurs. It is not at a given point in time. The implication being is that creation itself is eternal. But then that entire concept we have of God creating comes into question. If creation itself is an ongoing process and an eternal process, how does that square up with our concept that God created us? We didn't exist and then God created. That seems to be a dilemma. We then look at the saying of Hazrat Ali. He who recognizes himself recognizes his Lord. I think that's something that most people are very familiar with. He who recognizes himself recognizes his Lord. But then we have to ask the question, if God has created and the creation is a separate thing from God, how does me recognizing myself help me to understand my Creator? The Creator is transcendent. The Creator is above and beyond all of his creation. We only exist within a short span within this concept of eternity. How does recognizing myself enable me to recognize something who I consider to be transcendent and above and beyond everything that I have in this physical world? So the questions that we're raising in today's session is really about us looking at a deeper understanding of what we claim our philosophies to be and how those philosophies match up to what our general understanding of creation is. And the thing that the whole concept of monoreality was, as far as I know, first mentioned within the memoirs. And actually, I've not seen it really explained anywhere else. But the memoirs itself goes into several bits of very, very key information that explain how the Imam is trying to explain this concept. And the key question we then need to address is, if we look at Imam's hint of saying, actually, don't think of creation, think of monoreality, how does that change some of these things that we need to do? How does that change our understanding of recognizing ourselves enables us to recognize God? How does it enable to understand that from Allah we come and to Allah we return? How does it enable us to understand that we live, move, and have our being in God? So the concepts that we are trying to get clear is that actually, in order for us to answer some of these very, very deep esoteric philosophies, the general concept of creation doesn't actually answer them. It doesn't help us to understand in what way are we created so that we can actually return back to our Lord. How can we understand our Lord by recognizing ourselves? Because that creation causes an understanding of separation. It causes an understanding of a God that is very disconnected from his creation. So when we look at these fundamental esoteric principles, they don't really correlate with the general concepts we have of creation. And that means that we now need to examine a different way of thinking about what creation is or what creation could be. And for that, we need to consider how the Imam has explained what monoreality is. Now, for the next session, that's what we are going to do, is to look at the concept of monoreality as the Imam has explained. And he has explained several different things that give us hints of what he meant. And the two terms that we're going to look at in a lot of detail, one is this concept of monoreality, which means one reality. And the second is a different terminology entirely to explain the creation. And the term that the Imam used is manifestation. He specifically went into a lot of effort to make it clear that in the deeper understanding of Islam, we, just like with the billiard ball model of the atom, so creation is the billiard ball model. In the deeper esoteric understanding of Islam, the correct way of looking at this is not creation, but manifestation. But that needs an entire understanding, first of all, to say, how do we believe that our general creation doesn't actually work? Then looking at, okay, what did the Imam mean by manifestation? What does that actually mean? How do we conceptualize manifestation? And how does manifestation enable us to understand what he was explaining about monoreality? So I'm hoping that in the next session, that is now going to become our focus. Now that we've gone through why creation is actually problematic for the deeper understanding, how we now look at these things of monoreality and manifestation and use them to understand some of these deeper questions and try and get a better understanding of why the Imam brought these about. So I'm hoping to actually refer to two documents for next time. One is the chapter 8 of the memoirs, and the second is actually the Farman of Usulaydin, which Sultan Shah made in 1889 or 1898, can't remember. So it would be really helpful actually if everybody could go through those for next time, because those two documents actually contain an awful lot of explanation around these philosophies. So I think my 40 minutes is up. I'm happy to answer any questions, and inshallah, hopefully we will take this on again further next week. Thank you, and Ya Ali Madad.
Ya Ali Madad Zahir, beautiful presentation. You have given us a lot to think about actually. I personally feel like I can't wait anymore for your next session, because you've already asked so many questions, but all the answers are in next session. So that's wonderful. Alhamdulillah. I have one question. It says, please explain the difference between monotheism and monoreality.
Okay, so that actually is very clearly defined again in that chapter of the memoirs. And monotheism simply is a word that says one God. And the Abrahamic faiths, so generally Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, believe in monotheism. They are what are known as monotheistic faiths. Unlike Hinduism, unlike maybe some other religions, they only believe that there is one God, not many gods. So the basic principle of monotheism is that there is one God. Monoreality is talking about something completely different. Monoreality does say there is one God, but monoreality goes much further and says everything is actually one thing. And that's the difficult part to understand, is when we talk to each other, we are different, we are separated. You're in Dallas, I'm in London. How can we be one? And that is the concept that we need to grapple with next time, is how do we begin to understand this concept of being one? I hope that answers it.
Subhanallah, subhanallah. Yeah, you did talk about it, and I think we'll go more in detail the next time. I would like to let everybody know that we do have the recording of the sessions, and hopefully we'll be able to share the chapter 8, which is published by Tariqa Board. We do have soft copy, and we will also share the Farman he mentions. And hopefully Zahir will be able to share the slides too with the friends, right?
Yes, sure, Nimet, not a problem.
Thank you. The same person is asking another question, which is, please highlight the importance of taqwa. Please highlight the importance of taqwa in relation to monoreality.
So again, I think we will look at that in detail next time. But I think one of the things about a lot of these deep philosophical terms that we use. So there are lots of terms that we use within trying to explain esoteric philosophy. And what I found personally is that once we start talking about monoreality and what monoreality implies, that actually our journey and these terminologies, so fanafila, taqwa, all these things begin to make a lot more sense in that journey towards understanding monoreality, because monoreality changes our relationship with God. That's the fundamental thing about monoreality, is what it definitely did for me is it changed how I look at what God is based on my original understanding of creation. So again, I think some of these things will come out as we understand this journey of us following this concept of monoreality.
So in other words, what you're saying that we do need to review the two references you have given, then I think we'll be better prepared to understand all the answers which you give in the next session, and we'll be able to relate to the concept of monoreality, relating it to taqwa too, right?
Yes, because I think in both of these documents, in the Sulaydin and in the chapter 8, um, they are really unique documents in that Imam has very, very openly spoken about things that are some of the deepest concepts of Ismailism. And he doesn't just use the words, he explains them. But it needs, um, you know, I've had to have memoirs explained to me several times over, not once, not twice. I'm talking about going over this document hundreds of times by people who are far better versed than myself. And that is the depth of information that the Imam has in those two documents.
I would second that, Zahir, because those documents are not easy. You really have to read, reread, I would say write it down to be able to absorb the concepts explained in these two documents. So you're absolutely right. I have received another question, Zahir. Have you had a chance to research the Sufi concept of Wahadat al-Wajud, or unity of being, as elaborated by the students of Ibn Arabi? I think there is a lot of points of comparison that can help us to understand these concepts.
Yes, I would definitely say that I have looked at several of the Sufi concepts, and there is definitely a lot of comparison. And in fact, Imam himself has referred to, understanding Sufi concepts in order to understand, a lot of our deeper concepts. But there are some fundamental things that, Sufism in general talks about a lot of the same things that we will be speaking about next week. But remember, a lot of Sufis, there are Sufis amongst Sunnis and amongst Shias. And one of the fundamental concepts that comes about within our understanding of monoreality is the need for imamate. And that is the differentiator, because once we start looking at the deeper concepts, the need for a living imam becomes fundamental to the whole concept of monoreality. And so I hope, again, we will explore that further.
Inshallah. Another question, does monoreality will help me find who am I in order to know who God is?
I can only answer that from a personal point of view. And for me, the answer was 1,000%. Until I came across monoreality, until people started explaining to me how different this is to the way we understand creation. I had a lot of questions as a youngster. I had a lot of doubts around, well, actually, how does this work? And ever since I've started reading up on monoreality, researching into it, and trying to look far deeper across the spectrum of information that the Imams have given us related to this, it has made me extremely comfortable in terms of who I am and what my relationship with my God is. That's all I can say. From a personal point of view, it has given me a lot of stability in understanding who I am and where I want to be. I'm not saying that I've reached where I want to be, by no means at all, but at least I have. It's really helped me to crystallize why we're here and what we are here to do.
So in other words, you're saying that at least we'll be able to have the certainty of knowledge, but the journey doesn't end there. We have to continue to walk in this path to get to the essence of it.
Absolutely. I've been looking into this concept for many years, and there is still more for me to learn. It is a very difficult concept, and there are very difficult questions that we still have to answer. But it is a far better journey that I've had with this concept than without.
Subhanallah, subhanallah. So I don't see any more questions on the chat. And I just again would like to announce that yes, we will share the recordings, his slides, as well as the two references he is talking about. So you will have time to ponder on it, read on it, and if you have questions, then you can prepare. And inshallah, next session, we'll listen to all the research he has had in his own learnings. So alhamdulillah, I would end today's session by saying that thank you so much for joining on Salgira Mubarak Day. I would like to pray for our speaker, Zahir Lalani, who has given his time on this auspicious day. We pray for you, Zahir, and your family for your beautiful khidmat. May Mola accept your seva in deen and dunya, bless you and your family in multifold time, and fulfill all your good wishes. Ameen. And all the friends online, Salgira Mubarak, may you all and your families have beautiful Salgira today. We have found ways to celebrate our Salgira with all the limitations, and we are so blessed. His mercy is amazing. We are showered with this rain of knowledge from everywhere. Alhamdulillah, may Mola give lots of barakat, prosperity, tranquility, happiness, peace, unity in the family. Bless you all. May Mola elevate everyone's rank, and may Mola all mushkil asan for all the friends online and their family. Ya Mola, Ismaili Jamaat ji kul mushkiliyo asan kar Mola. Ismaili Jamaat ji kul नेक उम्मीदों पूरी कर. Ya Mola, humanity is going through this COVID-19 Mola, mushkil asan for the whole Jamaat Mola, and happy birthday to you from each one of us. Yali Madad friends, Yali Madad.
Maulani Madad.